Hello! Welcome back to another episode 7 this time. On my end, I'm in a new space, so this is why this is a different space than usual. But yeah, welcome back to Got Melanin. I'm one of your hostesses with the most. This is Melina.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back. I am Mari. This is Got Melanin. We're so happy to have you back in our new home and regular home, and we are so happy to welcome our two guests, Terri and Emily. We have a great show coming up for you in the wake of everything that has happened in the past 2 weeks since you've missed us. We have a ton to say, and like we start every single episode, we are going to start here with we are still seeking justice 170 days later for Breonna Taylor. We are still 365 plus days seeking justice for Elijah McClain. And newly, we are now putting our energy into Jacob Blake and everything that has happened in the past 2 weeks. And that's where we are today. When we originally set up this series, Got BLM, where are we now? I don't think that this is where we thought we would be.
No.
But here we are, and we're ready to have the conversation with you, all of our listeners, and with our fabulous guests. And so to start it off, I think I'm going to let them introduce themselves to the people, because I know we know how great they are, and I think it's time that everybody else finds out how wonderful they are. I will start with Emily. Why don't you tell us a bit about yourself and why you wanted to come on this fun program?
Great, thank you. My name is Emily Williams. I am a lifelong social justice activist from the Midwest in the U.S. Chicago is home for me.
My time.
I have been involved in Africa solidarity work for the last 10 years. I have a background in racial justice and gender equality, and I work with organizations to increase their capacity to leverage their missions to fight for social justice through global programs and leadership development. And I'm here because I'm just so happy to be having this conversation. I think it's so important to be connecting with Black women around the world about what we're experiencing in this moment and also creating healing spaces. So that's what I'm looking forward to today. And thank you for that, Melina and Mari. Thank you for this space.
Oh, not us. No. Honestly, we're just so happy to have you here, and everything you've done is just, and I love another Midwestern Chicago girl. So.
Yeah.
Terri, why don't you tell us about yourself? Give us all the perspective.
So I'm British Jamaican. I live here in Belgium. I've been here for about 6 years. I work as a civil society strategist and analyst, mostly kind of supporting nonprofits in the how and why they can do their work, but with a decolonial and feminist lens. I have a kind of weird career background. I started out in linguistic anthropology. I ended up specializing in political communications, kind of rooted in global politics and human rights law. And I've just spent the last 13 years mostly working in the peace, conflict and foreign policy space with NGOs across Europe and as an advisor to the EU. Apart from a brief stint teaching teenagers and trying to learn some Arabic in Jordan, I have mostly been kind of living in different kind of European countries until Brexit, at least. I'm really, really pleased to be here because I think for the last few years, particularly, especially kind of seeing the parallels between what's happening in the social justice space and how that ties into a lot of work that's done in the so-called development space or in the foreign policy space, and just seeing that those parallels aren't being connected. And it kind of felt like, from my own position, I'm a Black woman, I'm a Black feminist, and it's impossible for me to exist in any kind of space without having a conversation about how it relates to racism, social justice, feminism. It would be ridiculous to try and tease out these as separate issues. So I'm super excited because I think, as Emily said, I completely agree that the transnational, the kind of different experiences that we have and the different positions that we speak from, I think
Thank you for responding to our call, because we wouldn't be here today if you two hadn't so gracefully accepted to be a part of this week's episode, which does, you know, serve to look at not only that those kind of transnational relationships between that exist like in our lives with where we live, but also just, you know, in general, I think to have a conversation, because frankly, like, we're traumatized. Like, it's been an insane, how many months now has it been? Because it feels like it's been 7 years. So
it feels like a lifetime, but I think technically it's around 4-ish.
4 months. Yeah,
it's about right.
And I think like Mari and I definitely felt it this week, or rather last week, because today's Monday. But yeah, like we definitely, you know, felt it last week. And I think that even when we had our phone call to just kind of like meet and you know, set up today's call and everything, like it was, you know, we were just kind of all still reeling from what's been happening. And these kinds of conversations are so important, because basically I got a message on my Instagram the other day that someone was saying like, because I mean, after Jacob Blake's shooting happened, obviously, first of all, like that was just all about like, how do you shoot someone 7 times in the back, as for what, like really for what? And then the fact that then there was this supposed vigilante that decided to also shoot at people. That's where for me it just hit like a lot, because I was just thinking, listen, if we're at the point now where you can't even like actually peacefully protest without being a potential next victim, then that's equally messed up. And someone had sent me a message and said like, wow, you know, I can't believe it took a global pandemic for us to realize like how racist the US is, and for the world to see like how racist the US is. And I was like, yes, but it is literally not just the US. It's you're seeing it in that case because it's very overt and it's very extra and it's very like in your face. But at the end of the day, like similar things happen across the world to people of color solely because they know that they can happen and that they can get away with it.
Yep.
And that's the point, is that this conversation today is to show like it is not just it is not a singular place issue. It is something that spans across generations, across continents, across societies, and it's something that like unless we address it, we can't actually move on from it and like ameliorate it in a way.
No, I think you're right. And I think honestly the first place I even wanted to start this conversation was how are you? We're sitting on a screen with 4 Black women who are experiencing the trauma of the daily life of living through this movement. And so much of, even what Emily referenced, having a healing space is proving that this movement affects people in a myriad of different ways. It is changing our lives and our existence and how we see the world in so many different ways. So I honestly wanted to ask each of you, how are you? Because we're sitting in very different spaces, whether Mel and I be both in the UK, London and Manchester are very different, right? Which is very different from Belgium, which is very different from the US. So how is everyone just feeling?
Emma, I feel like you should go first.
Yeah, word, Mari. You same question, back at you. Like,
oh, I'm tired. I'm exhausted. I am. Do you know, we've had this conversation a lot, and I feel like every time I'd like to think that I'm hopeful and that I'm optimistic and that I'm looking for the moment that tells me everything is going to be okay. And every time I start to feel like that moment is coming, like we get a Black woman, a woman of color as a vice presidential candidate nominee, we start to see bills like the police brutality bill be in the House and in the Senate. When I see the protesters in my city of Chicago making good change happen, when I see continued protests in London, things changing, I get when I see us having this space and people listening and paying attention, I get optimistic. But then I get things like Kenosha, right? And not only did I get Kenosha, I got Kenosha and 2 protesters died. And not only did I get Kenosha and 2 protesters died, I got Jacob Blake handcuffed to his bed. I am tired, is what I am. And I am saddened that every time I feel like we are taking 2 steps forward, I feel like I take 6 steps back. And I want to be walking in the resilience of the John Lewis's, and now rest in power, the Chadwick Boseman, and all the people that are laying foundations. But on a base level, I'm tired. Like, I'm tired. Yeah, that's where I'm at, which is why I wanted to talk to other people. So, yeah.
Terri, how are you feeling? Oh, yeah, Emily, go for it. Sorry.
Go ahead, Terri.
I remember feeling like for pretty much the entire month of June, I had insatiable amounts of energy, most driven by just anger, rage, and like, no, we're done. No, that's it. I think that was, there was that sensibility. But at the same time, I remember speaking to friends and saying, oh no, I cry every day. Like, oh no, like, I have this energy, but there is a moment where I stop, and because it just feels, it feels utterly ridiculous. Like, why are we still having this conversation? The cognitive dissonance that you have before you can even have the conversation is emotionally wearing, it's intellectually wearing. And I've kind of likened it a little bit, drawn parallels between how people reacted to the Me Too movement and how people reacted after the killing of George Floyd. There was an understanding with the Me Too movement that all of these people were suddenly remembering traumas or incidents that happened to them, where they were like, wow, I was assaulted, or this happened, and even things that they maybe hadn't thought were problematic or they'd buried, that there was this collective outpouring of suddenly remembered trauma. And for me, what June was, in speaking to my friends and my family and my friends being a lot of kind of other Black women and women of color, was the same feeling. It was speaking to my dad and having him talk about, fear of the police growing up on the streets of London in the 70s, and just all of these buried memories of experiences of racism that suddenly come to the fore. And yeah, this is, sorry to say it in such a British way, but this is nonsense. No, it's nonsense, and it is no longer possible to not speak about it, and it's no longer possible to pretend that this doesn't take a toll. If people can muster up the imagination to understand how remembering sexual trauma and violence could be quite traumatic, then they can muster up the imagination to imagine that the exact same thing is true for racial trauma and the continuing, it's not even post-traumatic stress, it's the ongoing traumatic stress. So you can muster up the imagination to understand that this is not a simple thing for particularly Black people, but I think, in general, the racial hierarchies that we see globally that aren't exclusively affecting people of African descent. But yeah, so no, tired, fed up, annoyed, like, yeah.
Emily, how are you doing?
Yeah, thank you. I am doing okay. I, like others have said, the trauma of like just racial injustice for me is like very acute, and I feel like it's been going on for a long time, almost as long as like I've been a part of any US institution, right? And so there's a part of me that, having recognized that, understanding that, is very resolute to continue to fight, right? I think, one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot is that, even when we're winning, right, like the establishment, right, like white supremacists, right, these institutions, they still have power, right?
Yeah.
So you know, even in these moments where we have these huge backlashes, right, where there's a vigilante, right, who's in coordination with the police, shoots 2 people, injures another, and is able to walk away from the scene, right, with cops looking right at his back, right? You know, that backlash in some ways is in response to our success, in response to our wins, right? In response to the visibility and the power that we've been able to build over the last several years, you know, of BLM, right? And so I think that that's one thing that we have to remember, right? And, you know, for anyone who is, you know, an activist, whether that's like in their own personal lives, in their own workspaces, out on the front lines, you know, in the streets, confronting cops, right? One thing that, you know, we know well is that, okay, if we weren't gaining power, if we weren't consequential, right, then there wouldn't be resistance, right? And so, you know, I personally, coming from a place of having really focused on kind of taking a step back from fights in my personal life, right? And so now I'm back at this place where I've been able to reflect on those fights, my wins, right? And the wins that, and the gains for other people, other Black people in those spaces. And I'm able to come back and say, okay, I'm 100% resolute about continuing to fight and what I can contribute to that fight. I also want to say that I just lost my grandmother, and her story is unfortunately not free of institutional violence. And so I want to say her name. Her name is Mary Williams. Just like a beautiful, beautiful person and spirit. You know, she migrated north to Wisconsin from Mississippi, and she lived until 94. You know, I realized in this time of caring for her that she's absolutely the most influential person in my life. So I just want to say her name and also recognize her life. And may she rest in peace and in power.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And thank you, first of all, for feeling the space to utilize this space to say the name of powerful people in your life. I think so often we talk about big figures and we talk about the legacies that they've left. But I know in my own personal life, and as you just stated, I stand on the backs of many powerful women and many powerful people whose names will never be stated, whose stories will never be told. So I appreciate that you took the minute to say her name and speak her truth to power. And I think that's so much of what this movement is doing, right? It is allowing your everyday person in their everyday space to be a quote unquote hero, to be an individual activist, to be a worker towards something better than what is themselves. And we're starting to see, or at least we hope, we're starting to see people make changes in their day-to-day lives, in their work lives. You know, I've seen it in my own work life. I'm starting to have conversations with people that I didn't have. I'm starting to be able to say things about my own trajectory and advocate for myself in ways that I was doing but was not being heard. So as we think about us being our own individual activists for ourselves and then obviously impacting the ones around us, how has everybody kind of been seeing your field or your job or your expertise change because of the way that this movement is impacting the world?
Well, I co-found my other job aside from getting Melanin on a podcast is I'm the co-founder of an organization that's called Demilitarized Education, or Deducation for short. And basically we work to get universities in the UK to commit essentially to world peace. When you say it like that, it's super broad, but it's essentially mostly to get them away from having investments in the arms trade, and having like research partnerships and like various other partnerships, and pushing graduates towards, you know, especially engineering students towards like, this is your only option as a job if you want to actually be able to survive financially in this world and such. And I think, so we created DED about like, officially it's been just over a year, but unofficially we're coming in on like a year and a half, close to 2 years now. And at first it was quite like, I didn't really think about like the racial aspects of that kind of activism and campaigning, because the people that especially up in Manchester, like it's a very white activist scene. It's not a bad thing. It's just what it is. And I didn't really kind of think about it. And also like all of these people are so passionate that I was like, oh, like obviously, yeah, we're just all in this fight together. But once kind of my eyes were fully open, due unfortunately to like George Floyd's killing and the consequent BLM uprising really that has happened, I just kind of came to realize that the space is a little too white, and that like the arms trade itself is extremely racist, because the only way that you're going to get people to think that having absurd defense budgets for arms manufacturing is by making them think that like there is such an enemy that is visible, and this enemy is brown and black. And I never, it's not that I didn't want to think that, but it's just that like it never really hit me before. And then once that became very clear, I was also just kind of like, okay, well, we need to take that into account as well. Like, we're not going to be able to stop the excessive and like, dare I say at times, corrupt arms trade that happens in the West without addressing the fact that the media portrays people risking their lives, asylum seekers, legal asylum seekers on boats as like a wave of refugees. It's not a wave. It's a couple of people on a boat that need our help. The fact that you can have a BBC team out on their own little boat, filming people literally drowning behind him, and then him commenting on the situation as if he's not there, is frightening. And I think that the fact that this is the way in which we are portrayed is scary. And like, there's no, do you know what I mean? So for me, the connection became very clear that like, you're not going to get people to realize how absurd, it's not that the arms trade is absurd, but the way in which it has just been like bolstered up, and the way that like it's got so much money flowing through it, the fact that it's given such a high priority when it comes to like country economics, when like in reality it doesn't even contribute to country economics that much realistically. But people are not ready for that conversation. I speak from firsthand experience. We can't address that until people realize that the reason why it's been bolstered up and like put up on such a high pedestal is based off of like racist imperial foundations. And it's not even that like when you try to bring it up, it's you know what I mean, like it's not as if people try to shoot you down of like, it's not about race, like they very much get it, but it's a forgotten aspect of it. Like, again, like why do we think that we as the West need to go and bring democracy in other places? Because the continent of Africa has been described as like a savage place for the last like 200 years. Why would you not think that that place is still full of savages if that's what's been the narrative and the rhetoric for ages, you know? So, and I don't know, even that kind of goes into like interventionist wars and whatnot, but that's at least for me in that sense, like it's really brought that up. And I tried to consistently, one of the girls that I call her girl, but she's definitely a woman, a strong Black feminist woman. Her name is Siana Bangura, and she works with Campaign Against Arms Trade. And she very much like pushes the idea of like, no, we need to realize the racial inequality and all of this before we can actually address this campaign against the arms trade. But yeah, so I try to take my inspiration from her when it comes to like addressing these topics as well in my everyday Mancunian campaigning life. But yeah, that's me. What about you, Terri? How's it been in your?
It's I mean, I work in a kind of, I guess, related field, or I come from at least a related field in that I come from peace building, which is a obscure, practically unknown area of kind of, it's not foreign policy, it's not development, it's not humanitarian. There's a list of the things it isn't, but essentially it's looking at how do you work on conflict without weapons and uniforms. Ta-da! So it's very much kind of linked to ideas of over securitization and militarization, and what are the alternatives. And I think, of course, it's always, I remember there's that meme going around of, like, you know, what would happen, how many industries would go completely bankrupt if women woke up tomorrow and decided they liked the way they looked. And in much the same way, what would happen to the arms industry, the security industrial complex that we have, and kind of the insane budget for militarization, if we woke up and decided that security was about kind of human security, it's about giving people a sense of freedom and peace, and free from, actually I wrote a blog post and it's about the word security, and actually it comes from the Latin securitas, which means free from burden, free from care. And so I made the point of, you know, what would happen tomorrow if we woke up and realized that actually all of these budgets were dedicated to making our lives free from burden and free from care. I'd be cool with that, but that's not what the investment in security is about. So yeah, there's definitely the logic of coercion, a clear, I think quite patriarchal kind of lens when it comes to security generally, but also, as you said, the fear of the other. What do you do when you've got no one to fight? What happens to your, I think in some ways we're kind of witnessing that with all industries, where there's things that we don't need and they're based on a logic, and when that logic is damaged because we don't need them anymore, it becomes problematic. So if we remove enemies, if we remove the other, if we get rid of these racial hierarchies, who have you got left to fight?
Yeah.
And I think there's, I kind of feel frustrated that in general, when we talk about peace and security, or in foreign policy, or in kind of home affairs when we're talking about police and security, why aren't we asking to what end, to what purpose? Because as far as I'm concerned, I'm very clear what security is for in terms of human beings, but they have an idea of security that's quite different. So yeah, I think there's understandings of security that themselves are that come from this kind of colonial era. Well, I mean, even pre that, it's feudal. It's this idea of kind of coercion, command and control from the top. And in order to have a top, you need a hierarchy. Race is one of those. Gender is another one of those. Like it's really just embedded in ideas of supremacy.
Definitely. Emily, I'm dying to ask, because you are one of the people that's actually in the States right now, and everybody's big thing is, CEOs and companies, and everybody's talking about inclusion post BLM. Everybody cares. What are you actually seeing on the ground?
Yeah, thank you. That's such a good question. And I also just want to say, in response to what's already been said, is that this is what I think BLM has done such a good job of. BLM and also prison abolitionists, right? Yes. They make the point that our defense budgets actually don't need to be massive, right? The amount of money that we spend on criminalization in prisons doesn't need to be so massive. We can just invest in communities, right? Yep. And give people what they need, right? So, I just want to say that. Also, that Africa is also one of the most democratic places on the planet, right? Africa is one of the most democratic places on the planet, right? Like in the last 3 to 5 years, there's been, I want to say, like more than 5 regime changes demanded by people's movements. Yeah. So I'll just put that out there, right, as just a counter narrative to, Melina, what you mentioned earlier, right? And also to say that some of what you did mention was horrifying, especially the way that, the issue around refugees, migration, how that gets characterized in global media, right? So a little bit about what I'm seeing, right? Like I tend to work in the nonprofit NGO space. The NGO world, the nonprofit world, and there's very much internalized white supremacy, right? And so that has been called out in major ways. I can't tell you the number of organizations who have been accused of discrimination, right? And who brings that analysis forward? It's oftentimes Black women, right? Also, like, you know, Black men also. But, you know, when you see, you know, the concerted campaigns, when you see people talking about their trauma, it's Black women who are coming forward in these spaces. And, you know, while I can say that, yes, organizations, companies have responded, right, to this moment of racial justice, but many of them did not do so without their employees pushing, right, without their Black employees speaking up, right? So it wasn't like automatically, you know, all of these nonprofits, all these NGOs, all of these companies said, oh, actually, this is based in our mission, so we better, you know, come out hard for BLM in the very same way that we came out hard for our employees around COVID-19, right? It wasn't that same kind of thing, right? People had to push it. And not only that, but people had to expose the contradictions, right? Like, you know, there's been some very high profile cases of companies who, you know, promote inclusion, especially around women, right? And then it's like, oh, wait, you find out that Black women's voices have been silenced for years, right? That they were experiencing extreme microaggressions. So, you know, I think what I would like to see more of, I mean, I think, you know, right now people are looking at like their hiring practices. People are looking at, okay, what are Black employees experiencing, right? And, you know, we need to change our HR policies, right? All of that is well and good. You need to do that. But, you know, we really start to see shifts when there's self-reflection, right? So when, and particularly white people within these organizations who also have internalized white supremacy, yes, you do, right? Okay, yes, you do, number one, right? So you have to reflect, right? You have to say, okay, how am I contributing to this problem, right? How have I made life difficult for my Black colleagues, right? How are Black women's voices silenced in this organization that I'm a part of, right? If you're not okay with that, then you need to make some changes, right? And it's okay that you don't have all the answers right away, right? You can actually like get those answers in community, you know, like in processes with, I don't want to put the burden on Black employees because I don't really want to spend a lot of time, you know, I don't see that as my role, right? As a colleague, right? I'm there to, you know, I need to preserve my own experience, right? But I do think that, especially in the nonprofit world, the NGO world, there needs to be more of a mapping at like how whiteness shows up in those spaces and how that marginalizes, you know, Black employees, Black workers, but then also people with other marginalized identities, right? Like this moment, and this is what I love so much about BLM, and when we really look at intersectionality, is that it's like, okay, we have to understand systems of oppression and who's most marginalized, right? So if we can make the experience better for those who are most marginalized, right, then everybody gets free, right? It gets better for everybody. So that's what I want to see more of looking at how whiteness shows up in these spaces and then how it marginalizes Black people and people of other marginalized identities.
Yeah. I think it makes me laugh because Melina knows on this show, I think I've said it multiple times, the scariest thing to white people that has happened in BLM is Amy Cooper. Because we talk about things being intersectional, and we have a lot of feminists who came real hard for the Me Too movement. We were standing left, right, and center. But the minute we had to talk about being a good liberal, you saw yourself on screen. Sis was a New York Democrat. She was everything that was supposed to be good and free about these types of movements. And you weaponized your whiteness with the swiftness when you felt threatened. And that is exactly what we talk about. Like, I think I've said it a million times, and it really makes me laugh because Terri talked about being a Black feminist. But I say this every time. If your feminism isn't intersectional, I don't want it. Keep it.
I'm with you. And I don't even know that she felt threatened in that moment, right? Why would she have felt threatened in that moment, right? She wanted to exert her power in a particular way, right? And she chose to do so. And she got caught in that moment, right? And there are people inside organizations, inside our workplaces, who do that every single day, right? Mm-hmm. You know, there's research that shows that Black women are the most harassed in any workplace, right? And racial harassment is part of that, right? A large part of it.
It is just, yeah, sorry, it's just like fuming inside. And it is just so, I have a friend who, I think for her sake, I'm just not going to say like what field she works in, but like basically she works in a predominantly white male field. And her team, it's literally, she's not only the only woman, but she's the only person of color on her team. And she was like, she said something to me along the lines of like, I have a work wig because if I ever go to work in anything other than that wig, I get thrown a bunch of questions. Did you cut your hair? So is that not your, do you have any hair? Is it, so, but what do you, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, it just still shocks me to this day that like, it's not even that people feel the need to ask these kinds of things. It's like, it doesn't, what does it, oh my God, sorry, I was about to speak French just now, but like, the saying is like, it doesn't look at you, so it doesn't concern you. It's not your problem. Like, why do you need to know these things? You know, it's the same. It's not the same, but it's like the whole question of like people who are transgender having to answer questions of like, oh, did you have a sex change? Like, what does your genitalia look? Why do you need to know? Why do you need to know why do you need to know if this is my hair or if this is not? Does this change the course of your day? Does this affect you in your life? Does this do anything to you other than satisfy this like zoo-like curiosity that you have about me and about like people who look like me and like what we do and stuff? It doesn't matter, like it really doesn't. And that's what blows my mind, is that like it's always seen as just kind of like, no, this is conversation, I'm curious, I want to know. There's other ways of fulfilling this curiosity, if you will. There's other ways of like getting the answers that you're looking for. That doesn't have to be so like, tell us what's under there, what you wearing, sorry, doesn't matter. You know, it's like I felt like when BLM really like started a couple months ago, we all just got handed this microphone and this spotlight. And I know a lot of friends that weren't ready for it and that couldn't answer necessarily these questions. And this is like also, they're at work like having to grieve for people that they don't know, but that they can relate to because of like this shared trauma that like we all have on this insane scale. And she couldn't even properly grieve because people then at work were being like, wow, yeah, so how are you, like, has this ever happened to you? Like, I can't believe it. It's, you don't have to, you can't believe it. It's there, it's happening.
I think one of the things one of the reasons I was really keen to participate in the discussion as well is that because it shows up differently. And I think it's really, I find it really important to talk about all the different ways that we are Black and all the different, therefore, manifestations and experiences that we have. And I wrote a story for a family collection, which was kind of, I guess, detailing people's different experiences of being racialized and racism. And I wrote mine called 100 Ways to be Black. And I actually made the point that for me, individual, interpersonal racism, because of choices that my parents made, because of the way that I speak, because of a particular educational background, and maybe some of the spaces I've been in, that interpersonal racism, and in a hostile way, is not as much part of my story as genuine, like instant awareness from being a child of racial hierarchies. Very much exactly aware of what is good in the world, what is bad in the world, what's beautiful, what's important, what's prestigious, what I need to be more like for people to, people that would come up to you and say, oh yeah, I think you have a pretty face because you have European features, and kind of going through life with these constant reminders of what coloniality is like that. And I think when it comes to some of the ways that, and I do distinguish, I guess, between kind of the personal experiences that you have of racism, even the structural experience of racism, and then coloniality, what I would call coloniality and white supremacy, which aren't all the same things. And in a way, one of the reasons why I've chosen to focus more on decoloniality is because there is amazing work being done on anti-racism. There's amazing work being done on kind of awareness and to some extent inclusion, but I think coloniality especially is even more relevant when you're looking at COVID, because it's not I don't want to be included in seriously messed up systems. So it's the reimagining and redesigning, and I think the point of, again, like I write this blog a word on words, because linguist, so this is my jam. This is like my understanding of all these words that we use in the non-profit world that we don't think about. But the word reform, yeah, I mean, there's so many deep problems with the idea of reform and amelioration and inclusion. And if we're going to be having these conversations about how should we build back better, how should we reimagine the world, do you honestly expect us to not have a conversation about decolonization when we're reimagining the world, are we? And you don't want to talk about
for real? Yeah. Like if this is a period of time, right, where like, because this is what blows my mind, is that like everyone is so quick, yeah, slavery, horrible. Yep.
What do you mean by everybody's so quick, slavery's horrible? Everybody's like, slavery, get over it.
No, but it's, yeah, I mean, that too, yeah. But like the idea of like, oh wow, that was such a dark period in humanity. And like when you think of like the middle ages of like, oh, I can't believe people used to like serfs and like all this stuff and like slaves and blah blah blah. But then it's like, okay, you do know how these things ended, right? Like revolutions. People had to like fight for what they believed in. People had to fight for their lives. And it wasn't this like fanning out where one day someone woke up and was like, you know what? I actually don't know that I want to own these like 150 slaves anymore. Like maybe I can just like start paying them. You know, I feel like that would be probably fair. No, the guy had to probably fear for his life. And then afterwards, do you know what I mean? Like things had to happen in a very like drastic way, which now we like to think of as, you know, we want to say like, oh yes, it's reform. It's just like, but that's just a really, really cute, polite way of saying it's a revolution, it's a change, it's a drastic 180 change that needs to happen. But people are not ready for that conversation yet because people are comfortable in where they're at and what's happening. And I think that's like the Haiti revolution didn't happen because Toussaint was able to turn around and convince people. Like, no. that's
the narrative, right? Like we talk about narrative, and it really takes me back to Terry's point of like, who is the good victim, right? Who is the good revolutionary? Like, people talk about, Nat Turner. Nat Turner said, I'm tired of slavery, right? And we don't talk about the effects of what people did post Nat Turner and what your response was, right? We talk about good victims. Why was George Floyd, quote unquote, a good victim? Why was Christian Cooper, quote unquote, a good victim? Because they weren't doing anything. But it doesn't matter. You doing something is not instance for why you should get shot. That's the whole argument that everybody's having right now with Jacob Blake. It's like, oh, well, was he stopping a fight or wasn't he stopping a fight? Or even just the narrative around who's a good activist, right?
Right.
I was watching CNN with Angela Rye, Don Lemon, Mike something, and Chris Cuomo. And he kept, and Mike something, whose name is not getting mentioned because I don't even remember it,
really, yeah,
was a Trump-supporting Republican. And he kept trying to differentiate between Black Lives Matter, big B, and Black Lives Matter, little b. And in my head, as I sat here on my spin bike, I kept going, sir, what is the difference between Black Lives Matter, big B, and Black Lives Matter, little b? And what I gathered from his entire conversation was he, as a white man, could reckon with, I genuinely mean reckon with, the idea that Black lives mattered, right? That people that are Black had lives that matter, but could not reckon with what he, quote unquote, said, which we all know is lies, the Marxist political group Black Lives Matter. And so I, as an activist and spending my time in Chicago, you know, I've spent a lot of time in activist spaces. And I really want to ask Emily, since I know you founded groups in Chicago that were in activist spaces, what do you say to people in these moments as we think about good victims, as we think about semantics of wording and how people are talking? What do you say to things like this when we're having these conversations of trying to create revolution?
And most importantly, are you a Marxist? Is the biggest question.
Wow, I don't think anyone has ever asked me that, right?
Okay, well, here we are today.
Like, what do you say?
I'm like, we're here today. Let's discuss. I mean,
Right.
clearly.
You know, I feel, the way I feel about that question, do I identify as a Marxist, is the same way I feel about do I identify as a feminist, right? And for me, they're both fraught, right? For the ways that they get used against people politically, right? So, and for me, I don't know that either quite captures the full extent of my politics and all of its nuance. So, no, I don't technically identify as a Marxist. Well, and I don't want anybody to come for me, but I also do not technically identify as a feminist, right? You know, and so I'm going to leave that there. You know, Mari, I think, and also kind of to what we've been saying, Mari, I'm so happy that you brought up like white liberals and white liberalism, right? Because right now they're really being confronted, right? Because it's like, you know, Melina, what you're describing, that's the thing that often doesn't get said, right? Is that these institutions remain so staunchly in place because people benefit from them, right? Yeah. And it's been, we know who benefits from them, right? It's, you know, white people benefit from white supremacy, right? Like, so that's why it's so difficult to bring down these systems and to bring down these institutions, right? Which are very harmful to a lot of people, not only Black people, especially Black people, but a lot of people, right? And so, you know, I think this notion that like there is no good protester, right? Yeah, there isn't, right? There is no like or there's no right way to protest, right? Especially if you're asking people who are benefiting from the system. And, you know, when I work with people inside organizations, you know, it's like change is really uncomfortable. And it's not only that it's uncomfortable, it is painful. Change hurts, right? You know, and so that's okay, right? Then one shouldn't then blame the person who's saying, okay, but this is racism, right? Let's address the racism. Let's be angry and like, let's condemn the racism, not the person who spoke their truth, right? And so I think that that's something that we have to continue to remember, is that one, when people are criticizing protesters, when people are criticizing, you know, the Black women who speak up in their organizations, it's like, okay, clearly this is your resistance to change, right? And so what's that about? Why are you not indignant about the injustices that are happening, right? Especially when we talk about white liberals, right? Like that, one would think that that's the response. And then two, this is why I think we have to be so resolute as especially Black women, because it's like, yeah, there's gonna be resistance. It's not fair, it's not right, it's not okay, oftentimes it's harmful, right? But that doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with what we're doing, right? That doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with the truth that we're speaking. And, you know, all of this being said, when I was just talking about not being a feminist, my master's degree is in women's and gender studies.
Literature, well, I think you need to find yourself appropriately, okay?
Thank you.
This is again, like, it's not necessarily the same discussion.
Yeah,
Like,
right.
Quite
Right. Yeah, thank you. But one thing I remember very well is that I was at a conference and Bell Hooks was speaking. And one of the things that she said, or one of the points that she made, is that, yeah, you know what, you better fight. And you better fight so that you don't feel victimized, right? And I think that that is so important to remember as a Black woman, that, you know what, like, I'll take the fight because I definitely am not feeling like your victim, right? Like that's for sure, you know? And also to just remember my power, right? And also like all the people who came before me and all the people who will come after me, like this fight is like worthy and valid, you know?
Yeah.
So
Definitely.
I
Definitely.
want to like base, because yeah, change is something that is difficult, it's painful, it can be insanely long, just as well as it can happen in the blink of an eye. And I think personally, one of the ways in which I've changed the most probably is being aware of like my own prejudices that I've held about our community. My mom's Congolese, and like it's not even my whole life, but it's like the narrative is that like Congolese people, like, yeah, we love to like dress really well and stuff because, stunning. And then like there's just this whole thing of like we like to party and stuff, but then there's also this huge narrative that's being told like by ourselves that we're lazy. And again, it's like, no, what the result that we're seeing today of this like quote unquote laziness comes from generations, if not centuries, of blocking access to education, to rights, like, I don't know, a myriad of things, right, that let a person evolve and grow into who they need to become, and therefore, build these societies which are so like modernized and whatnot. But it's actually not, do you know what I mean? Like I had to come to that, my own realization of like, wow, this whole time that like I joke that like Congolese people are lazy. No, we suffered like, I'm not gonna say the worst period of colonialism, because every form of colonialism is horrifying and not right. But King Leopold II, I'm not his biggest fan. I was definitely glad when his statues came falling down. I was like, yes, that, I don't know how come we didn't do that from before, but like, yeah. And I had to kind of come to face my own prejudice. And also like my dad is white French. I also have this aspect that's like light skin, this, that, I've been French my whole life. I've only been black the last like 6 years. It's weird, but like literally that's how I've been. And so I kind of want to put out the question to all three of you of just kind of like, what, if any, has that been also kind of a job that you've had to do for other people, but then also for yourself, of having to kind of look internally at like opinions that you held, or like or things that you never even realized. Like I never realized this, but like I was under the impression that like every dark-skinned man like would fetishize me, which is crazy because first of all, like, you're not Melina, sit down, but also like but also it came from going to Congo and having like all of these men that I don't know just like look at you like, oh my god, light skinned, like mixed, da 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 da. Like it's got its own levels of, you know what I mean? I had to come to that realization of like, oh my gosh, like this whole time I just keep thinking these things, but it's actually so not true. It's my perception of what they see me as, which has been told to me not only necessarily by them, but also by just like Western culture of like how light-skinned girls are treated by dark-skinned men, or how light-skinned girls are treated by even white men. Like it doesn't really, do you know what I mean? So yeah, I just want to put that out there, feeler, see what you guys think or say or whatnot. Yeah. Anyone? Mari, Terri, Emily?
All of us have like plenty to say.
I know. Like, how much time do you have here, ma'am? You have a whole episode that you just wanted to start?
I'm sorry.
I think it's a really, really interesting line of discussion, and it opens up some,
yeah, a lot of.
yeah. And I think too, this is where like we just have to like unlearn our internalized stuff, right? I mean, we're not immune from white supremacy. We're not immune from colonialism, right? And that's in some ways why like those systems have endured so long because we internalize those ideas too, right? And you know, especially as children, like, you know, and the many ways in which we have privileges, light skin privilege in the US, like hair privilege is such a big deal, right? You know, and so all of these things, you know, I can relate, especially also being biracial, right? And having a white parent, that one does have to unlearn them, you know, but I don't think that that is something that we should like hold against ourselves, right? Like I think, you know, for me, it's been most useful to think about that as like a healing process, you know, because it's also in many ways not fair, right? Because then, you know, the worst form of it is that we're then participating in violence against other Black people, you know, and that's not nice, right? That doesn't feel good, and that's not, you know, it causes harm, right? So yeah, I think that process of like unlearning the internalized white supremacy, the internalized colonialism, right? The internalized heterosexism, right? You know.
No, I think, and I think that's where I would go, and I have to agree. It always takes me back. There's been a meme that's been going around, and it's sad. It was funny at first, and now it's like kind of sad. But it was like, educated and bougie Black people, you need to unlearn that people that aren't like you are still worthy of fighting for in BLM.
Yeah.
And that I kind of touched on that when I said we need to unlearn this ideology of the good victim, right? Of the narrative that says this is an appropriate way to be. So much of having this conversation is showing that Black women and Black people are a myriad of different things, and that is okay. That is important, and we should be acknowledging that. And yeah, I think we all are going to come to the table with our own level of previous bias. I think it's you know, I went to a lot of all-white schools. Been in a lot of spaces that tell you, you know, what's acceptable and what isn't. And to a certain point, you definitely allow yourself sometimes to cope in those spaces because it's easier than fighting against yourself, even when that doesn't feel right. I may be gut-wrenched inside, but it feels like the easier way to just be like, I'm gonna toss my hands up because I already know that I have to be 2 times better than everyone around me. So now you want me to be 2 times better and a revolutionary, and you have to get to that space in your own time. And I'm very much with Emily. It's, you know, now granted, I have 2 Black parents who I used to be like as a kid, guys, can we just allow normalcy? We don't need Stephen Biko and Malcolm X in every quote at every dinner table. We don't. Sorry. But and in reflection, that was my own discomfort in like their complete resoluteness and already going through their own transformational processes of dealing with their own internalized prejudice. But I had to get there. Like I genuinely had to get there. And that's a lifetime and still a today time of getting there. And I think the more we allow ourselves to be imperfect when having this conversation, that's exactly the narrative that BLM is, despite what people think. It's saying that we're in hoping for change, we're acknowledging we have to be a part of that change. We may not be the power that be to break down said system, but we also are going to have to work on some things within our own community. Our first step is dismantling this power structure that's screwing us over. But our second step is having conversations in our own community where we need to also be better. They're 2 different conversations, but they're both important.
Yeah, I think this idea that everyone has talked about the need for self-reflection is pretty key, and actually something that I don't always think that enough attention is paid to our own need to do our own reflections. And the fact that again, in this story that I wrote for my family, I wrote down kind of I had this very obsessive individualism as a child, like this kind of really this idea that I will be who I want to be. And I spoke about the fact that it came from, you know, in my own childlike way, and actually still something I do genuinely believe, is that if you look at the histories of white supremacy and colonization and what we live with now, it's a history of white societies dictating what Black people can do, what they can think, where they can go, what they can be. I have zero intention of allowing a single white or Black person to tell me what I can and cannot like, what my preferences are, the way that I can show up in the world. No, absolutely not. And that's also one of the reasons that I've struggled with. I've never been someone who joins groups at all, probably for the same reason, like rampant individualism. And it's one of the things that's always kept me on the margins of, I've definitely never described myself as an activist. And probably one of the reasons I don't is, again, there's been a kind of limited idea of what activism can be, that first of all, I think is wrong. And second of all, I think is deeply unhelpful, because I have this phrase, orchestra of action. I'm like, we literally need everyone playing their different instruments, sometimes soft, sometimes loud, sometimes it's a solo. But you know what? If you're a violin, don't play the drums. It's fine that I grew up in white spaces. I come from a working class, definitely not in any way privileged Black background on my parents' side. They migrated from Jamaica, but they made one choice when they got married, and it ended up that I went to kind of pretty much all white private schools. I have this voice. I was told by my father and my mother, like, we don't believe in private education. We don't believe education should be privatized, but the way that Black children go through the school system in the UK, we can't take the risk. But we want you to understand that we're doing this because people are still stupid enough to believe that if you sound a certain way, if you went to this school, if you wear this tie in an interview, they're still stupid enough to believe that that matters. And while they're still stupid enough to believe it matters, we're going to take advantage of it. I was told that. I was told that from it. So all of the things I am, complicated. And when you're Caribbean, it's also complicated. Jamaica doesn't exist without Britain. I'm not a Taino Indian. Like, I'm sorry. So I think it's super important to, I've always been aware of what my privileges are and all of the things that I've been given that are nothing to do with my own personal, and I think that's also made me probably quite empathetic with others, because I know that I have a really, really privileged existence. I know that I have a different experience, and I'm okay with that experience because, yeah, if I'm a violin, I'm a violin. And I'm going to take my space in the violin chair and do my thing from where I am, which is in foreign policy, in NGOs. I'm not going to try and do my activism somewhere else. I'm going to do it where I'm best placed to do it and where my talents and my abilities lie. And then that means that you can be an activist as a bus driver, as a nurse, rather than going like, if you don't do this, you're not an activist. I don't have time for that.
Couldn't agree more. I could not agree more. The education is a place for modern day peacemakers. So feel free to join us. Like, like that's the whole, because I told my co-founder, I was like, look, you can be out in the streets and stuff, but I'm out here with like a settlement status, leave to remain. I'm not trying to put myself in a situation where they're going to be like, actually, you're a threat to the country, so we're going to have to remove you.
No, no, there's a richness. I'll leave it. But there's a richness that I like to acknowledge.
Yeah, we need the part two.
Yeah, Emily. I mean, I feel like Terri just gave me a whole like snap, send the thing down moment. But I want to give Emily a chance to give last thoughts. And people stay tuned because there probably will be a part two. We like part twos in this team. So, Emily, bless us with your last thoughts for sure.
Thank you. One of the things that BLM did such a good job of is like just raising the political consciousness, right? That you can see like a framework and analysis of anti-Black violence, not only in the US, not only in the UK, but like also globally. And one of the things that is also popping up right now and has popped up in the last few weeks is Zimbabwean Lives Matter, right? And so I think, many people are not aware of the situation in Zimbabwe. And so the use of the hashtag, really alerted people's attention to like the kind of violence that's taking place there, right? Just for a teeny tiny little bit of context, Zimbabweans have been fighting against, state and economic oppression, and also like the interpersonal violence that's shaped by systemic oppression for decades, and acutely for the last couple of months as COVID-19 has really exacerbated the economic situation there. And at least 12 people are in hiding in the country right now because they organize like an anti-corruption and anti-poverty march in the country, right? And so then we saw the hashtag emerge, where there's just been more global attention to the issue. And so I think that too is something that I would like to see more of, right? Like Zimbabwean Lives Matter is also a call to Black activists in the US, right? Black activists all over the world to also respond to that call in Zimbabwe. And so I know that we're out of time, but we see like a lot of similarities in terms of people putting their lives on the line to protest, right? When we see there's impunity for the violence that is done to Black bodies, right? And then also like how that gets erased from like the global news cycle, right? So I just wanted to raise that up, and then also just really elevate that call to be aware about what's happening in Zimbabwe, to get active on that issue, and because it's an important struggle, right? And it's also a struggle against capitalism. It's a struggle against the legacy of colonialism, right? Against white supremacy, and also patriarchal violence. So I'll leave that there.
No, that's perfect. And honestly, that's how we end every show. The same way we end every show, we want to remind our US listeners, vote. Get registered to vote. Drop your ballots off early if you can. Mail in. We don't care. Get it done. Stay in the streets. Now you just heard about Zimbabwean Lives Matter. The same thing that we talk about every episode. This is Mel and I as friends, and now our new friends, having conversations and providing perspectives. But it is your duty, it is your job to go back to your community and be the best you that you can be and continue these conversations. Get active in the ways that you can be active, whether that is on the streets, behind the keyboard, donations, whatever that looks like for you, do that. And don't stop doing that because somebody tells you that they don't want to hear it. So thank you to both of our guests. Come back, come back, come back. Don't be shocked if there isn't a part 2 or some diverging point that we get off to, because that's who we are as people. But as always, thank you everyone for coming to Got Melanin.
Thank you.
Everybody gather round and listen to my song.